In this second Godot tutorial of the item generation series, I'll teach you how you can add random magical properties to your item generation system. Let's get started. In the last tutorial, we have started with our item generation system. Let's do a quick recap. We are starting with the item determine type, which randomly picks an item from an item list. Then we determine the rarity of that item based on a rarity distribution. So common items are more common to spawn in than, for example, legendary items. And then finally, we were calculating the stats of the item, which included a modifier for the rarity, so that legendary items are more powerful than common and uncommon items. Now we have to add the magical system on top of this. I'm going to be replacing these three lines and I'm going to be putting in the code that we're going to need. And as you can see, there's quite a lot to unpack here. So let's first unpack this piece of code, which then activates all kinds of functions to actually make that happen. So here we go. We're going to start with determining whether the item is going to be magical or not. For that, we're going to be taking into account the rarity that we have already determined. So common and uncommon items will have a less chance to be magical than legendary items. Now, if the item indeed rolls back as magical, we are going to be determining if there is going to be a prefix and or suffix. I'm going to go with a fixed 50% chance that once the item rolls magical, there's a 50% chance for a prefix and a 50% chance for a suffix. So that means that even if you roll magical, it's not going to be a guaranteed magical item. Although you could of course code that in. Now, if both the prefix and the suffix come back as null, in other words, we were unlucky, then we want to set magical back to false as well, because if we don't have a prefix and suffix, that means the item is not magical. In that case, we can also erase the prefix and suffix keys that we have added here in that dictionary, as those won't have any function anymore. Otherwise, that means that we either have a prefix or a suffix, or we have both. We want to check, well, if we have a prefix, we need to calculate the stats of that prefix, and if it is a suffix, we need to calculate the stats of the suffix. With that done, we now have basically the template by which we are going to be adding these magical properties. Now let's go in these functions one by one, and of course we also have to take a look at the data, because of course we have expanded on that as well. From the top, let's first look at that item determine magical function. This function needs to return true or false whether the item is magical, and we store that under the magical key in the new item dictionary. We have that function right here, and please do note that I've collapsed all the other functions so that we can focus on one function at the same time. We determine the variable new item magical, which we return. We randomize the seed, and as I said, we want to include the rarity of the item to determine the magical, if it's magical or not. So for that, we're going to need a little bit of data. Going to the game data singleton that we already had from the last tutorial. Here we got the 4 variables that we had from the last tutorial, and I've added 4 more variables to the mix. For now, the only variable that's important is the item magical chance. We'll cover the other 3 variables here in a moment. Here I've defined what the chance is in percentages of the item spawning. So a common item will have 15% chance to spawn as magical, and a legendary item has a 90% chance to spawn as magical. Going back to that script, the main script, we have randomized the random number generator. We're going to roll a random number between 1 and 100. And if the magical roll is smaller than or equal to that game data item magical chance and the new item rarity, that being pushed into this function here at the top, as we have defined that here already. If that is indeed true, then, well, we have a magical item, congratulations, and otherwise, well, we're unlucky, and that's going to be false. We return that, and now we know whether the item is magical, yes or no. If that item indeed returned magical, if that is true, then we need to determine the prefix and the suffix. For our prefixes and suffixes, we have the item determine prefix and item determine suffix functions. These are going to be returning the name of the suffix or prefix that are going to be stored in the prefix and suffix keys of the new item dictionary. Now we're pushing the item ID of this new item to the function. And the reason for that is that we don't want every single suffix or prefix to be able to spawn on every single item. To me, it doesn't make much sense that a weapon, a sword or an axe, would be allowed to have a magical property add defense. Not the kind of thing that I would want in my game, but again, this is highly customizable. Do it however you want to do it. In order to get that done, we of course need that data. So I've made changes to the item data table that we already saw on the last tutorial. So here we have our 6 items with the various parameters, with their stats and their rarity modifiers. And at the end here, I have added a number of prefixes and suffixes, and I've indicated for every single item whether or not that prefix or suffix is allowed to spawn to generate on this item. So for example, for our sword and axe, yes, of course we want things like fierce and sharp, but of blocking, of stout and of vigorous, no, that's not for our sword and axe. They can, however, have the suffixes of the flame, of storm, and maybe the sword has the ability to add agility, but maybe the axe does not. I'll leave that up to you to make this. If you have a more complex item system, you might want to consider doing this data structure in a different way. I'm not saying this is the only way to do this data structure. This is just an example of how you could do it. But you could, for example, also say in a magical suffix or prefix or property table, you could say, well, the category, as we have categories and types as well, you could also say, well, every weapon can have these prefixes or suffixes, or every sword can have these prefixes or suffixes. So depending on how complex you make your system, you can optimize the data structure, and this is definitely not the only way you can do that. Okay, going back to Godot, because that's much more interesting. Let's have a look at this function and let's see how we are going to be incorporating both the 50% chance to spawn the prefix or suffix with determining what that prefix or suffix should be. Scrolling down to that function, we can close the item determine magical, open up item determine prefix. So we are first going to determine the variable new item prefix, and that is what we're going to be returning. So that's going to be the name of the prefix if we roll one. We're going to first randomize the seed of the random number generator, and we're going to roll a number between 1 and 100. As I said, I want a 50% chance for a prefix to spawn. So if the prefix roll is bigger or equal to 50, then we're spawning a prefix. If that is not the case, the prefix is going to be null, and that is what will be returned. Now, however, we are spawning that prefix, we are going to determine the prefix pool. We need to determine the pool of all the prefixes that we are allowed to draw from based on the item type. To do that, we're going to be iterating over every prefix in our singleton game data item magical prefixes. This is where 2 of the other variables come in. Right here we have these 2 variables, item magical prefixes and item magical suffixes, which is basically a list in an array of all the prefixes and suffixes in the game. With that said, we're iterating over that list, over that array, and we're going to look up for the particular item ID that we're pushing to this function, to the particular prefix that we're currently iterating over, if it is true, yes or no. So this is basically going to be iterating over, for example, fierce, sharp, blocking, stout, vigorous, barbed, for example, a sword, and it's going to look which of these are true and which of these are false. If they are true, we're going to be appending that prefix in our prefix pool so that that prefix pool becomes populated with all the prefixes that are allowed to spawn on this particular weapon. Now that we have that pool, we can determine which one it is going to be by taking the prefix pool and randomly drawing an index from that pool. And we take the pool size into account for that, so that whether you have 2 prefixes or 17 possible prefixes on, for example, a sword, it is going to be drawing one random index from that pool of prefixes that you have defined. That is going to be returned, and of course we can have a quick look at that item determined suffix, because this looks pretty much exactly the same, only here of course we're looking at suffixes instead of prefixes. Now with that said, that means that now we have both a prefix and a suffix, and these are 2 names of prefix and suffixes. However, as I have shown you, it's also possible that it returns as null in case that we were unlucky, because there's only a 50% chance for a prefix and suffix to spawn. In this particular example that I'm making, again, customize this for yourself. As I've shown you, if both of these are null, so that means that we're quite unlucky, we can set magical to false, and we can erase the prefix and suffix key out of the dictionary. We don't need it anymore. If you don't want that to happen, if you say like, well, no, because that means that, you know, legendary items have a 90% chance to be magical, and I really want that to be 90%, then there always needs to be either a prefix or a suffix. Well, in that case, you could take out this 50% chance of spawning them, or you could maybe say, well, if the prefix returned as null, then the suffix is going to be a guaranteed roll, like it's going to guarantee to be there. That's all up to you. Like I said, these systems are highly customized to the balance of the particular game that you make. Okay, with all of that said, else is basically saying that, well, else, that means that either the prefix or the suffix is not null, and it means that the item is indeed magical. Well, in that case, we check, well, if new item prefix is not null, then we calculate the stats, and if new item suffix is not null, then we're going to calculate those stats. How we calculate those stats? Well, let's dive into that next. As you can see, both of these lines of code make use of the same function, item determine magical stat. That's the last function we have to unpack, and then we're done. When we scroll down, let's close up the item determine prefix and suffix function. Let's open up this magical stat one. We of course first define the variable magical stat value, which is the value that we are, or the variable we are going to be returning. In between, we do all the calculations, and there's quite a lot to unpack here. But before we can do any calculations, we actually need some data. We need some values. For that, I've added a new data table. Not this one, this is the item data table. I've created an entire new Google Sheet that is going to be a separate JSON that will also be uploading into our game data singleton. In here we got the magical properties, a list of all the prefixes and suffixes in the game. The stat that they're actually changing, so of the flame, for example, adds fire damage, and fierce adds attack. Here we got the stat min and stat max, so this is going to be the range in between which that magical property can spawn. And here we got some helper text to help yourself in the data what you're actually working with. That, okay, percentage block shouldn't be very high because obviously that will break things. But it's also the text that you will be able to use, for example, when you got an inventory system, you got an inventory tooltip and you need to display that stat. Well, 2 to 7 is not going to be enough for the player to really determine like, what is this? So this magical stat text can be used in graphical user interfaces to communicate to the player, give the player some feedback on what that magical property exactly does, so that the player can make an informed decision on what items he or she would like to equip. With that done, we are going to have a look at the game data. Here we got the magical properties data, empty dictionary, similar to how we had the item data. And here under the ready function, we now basically have a duplicate of that code that was loading the item data sheet 1. Now we're also loading the magical properties data sheet 1 JSON that I have, of course, added to the data. So if I have a quick look here at the file system, I can open this in the file manager, and you'll see that in my data folder, I now have both the item data sheet 1 JSON and the magical properties data sheet 1 JSON. They both come out of that Google Sheet. All right, with that said, let's go back to that function and let's have a look and let's unpack this. So we are first going to be retrieving the minimum stat value and the maximum stat value. These are not calculations, these are simple retrievals out of that data table. And I do that to make sure that I can use these variables in the various functions down here, because otherwise these lines of code are going to be very long. Once we've retrieved those stat values, we are going to be calculating a map modifier. I thought I'll switch things up a little bit. Let's add the map level to determine what the range of the stat is going to be. Again, like I said, this is not going to be like a complete item system that you may want to use. I'm just using various elements, giving you various ingredients to practice with and to show you so that you can build your own system. On the top here, I don't need this X anymore, we got the map current level and the map maximum level. So for example, if you are running on a map and that map is level 45 and you want the items that spawn on that map to be stronger than, for example, if you were to run on a map of level 2, then of course you need to incorporate that in your item system. So let's do that for this particular stat of the magical property. So right here we got about, well, what is that, 55% or something like that. We are going to define a new float, because of course this number will be below 1, so it has to be a float. If it's an integer, it will automatically be 0. So we're going to turn that into a float of the map current level, and we divide it by the float of the map maximum levels. That's going to return 0.55 or something along that line. Then we want to determine the minimum stat, taking that map modifier into account. Now, there's a long line of code here, so let me just go over it one by one. The first thing we basically do is we have to determine the difference between the minimum and the maximum value. So for example, if we are having a look at Fierce here, it has a min of 20 and a max of 60. So we're going to first determine the difference. That's going to be 40. Then we are going to multiply 40 with the map modifier, which would be like 0.55 or something along that line. So it's going to be about 22, 23 or something like that. So once we got that value 22, 23, we then add the minimum value again so that we get our 42. And that's correct, right? Between 20 and 60, you are at about 42, 43. That is going to be the value that you're going to be working with. So with that done, we are now going to be multiplying that, or I'm multiplying it as an example, with 0.8. And we're going to do exactly the same function so far for the max stat, and we're going to multiply that by 0.2. So basically what we're doing here is we are trying to introduce a little bit of randomness. Not that you're walking on a map and every single axe and every single sword that you find will have exactly the same value for the particular magical property Fierce. That's going to be weird if all the magical properties of all the items that spawn on one particular map always going to have exactly the same value. You want to introduce a little bit of randomness there. So that's why I'm determining a min stat and a max stat, and the difference between those two is one is being multiplied by 0.8 and one is being multiplied by 0.2. However, this can mean that if you run on, for example, map level 80 of 80, the magical stat max is going to return the 60. That 60 is going to be calculated, multiplied by 0.2, and suddenly your maximum value is going to be 72. Now that's probably undesired, and that's why we got this clamp function here. Clamp makes sure that a value can go beyond certain boundaries. So we are taking this entire value that we have now calculated, and we can say, well, you cannot be lower than the min stat value and you cannot be higher than the max stat value. That's also important for the minimum, by the way, because otherwise you could have that if you are running on level 1 map and you multiply by 0.8, it could be that your 20 is going to be something along the line of 16 or something like that. So with this clamp function, we make sure that those stat values stay within the boundaries that we have dictated in our data table, but they can be random on the up and bottom side. Then we randomize the seed of the random number generator, and we're going to pull a random range function between the min stat and the max stat. Random range takes two floats, which is good because the clamp outputs a float as well. The output of the random range function is a float as well, and we probably want to round this down or have this just simple numbers. You could also do a round down function here. I'm just going to turn this into an integer, make it a little bit easy on myself, so that we have a fixed value, another float with 17 decimals. That is then going to return that magical stat values. That's going to come up here, and we are going to store that in the prefix key of new item. So basically what this does, if the prefix here, for example, is Fierce, that means that now new item will create a new key called Fierce, and that is going to have that value. This way we can connect the prefix with the actual value that it has, and we know exactly what we need to do with that once we start introducing or equipping this item to a character, and we need to calculate the character's final stats. Now with all of that done, let's do a quick demo. Starting up the game, as you know from the last episode, there's nothing fancy going on in the visuals. Everything is in the output here. So let me make this one a little bit bigger. Now when I hit that space bar, we of course have to find a magical item first, and this one apparently was not magical. And here we go. We got here a 11001, so that is a sword. The magical is true. The prefix is sharp, and here we can see that sharp is 13. So that means you're going to get 13 more attack, I believe that it was, or was sharp bleed. No, it's a bleed actually. It's bleed damage for the next 5 seconds. So that has rolled quite nicely. And as you would expect with the map level 45 by 80, about 55, somewhere in the middle of that stat, or somewhere in the middle would be about 15. So that sharp 13 is probably a little bit on the low side of that 0.8 modifier that I've included. But yeah, that looks like it's working quite well. We can go a little bit further. Here we have an epic, what is it? An epic shield, I believe, of with the prefix stout. It's gonna add 48 defense, I believe that prefix does. Now let's see if we can get some more. Here we have an axe, that is the 10002. It's magical. It does not have a prefix, but this one has the suffix of the storm, and of the storm here is 109. Let's see if that is realistic. 109. Lightning damage 25 to 180, so that will be 205. We're at about 112, I guess, would be the about value, and upper minus 20%, 112, 109. It's perfect. Now we have to be quite lucky in order to get one that has both a prefix and a suffix. But it looks like here we got one. Here we got an item. I believe this is a steel armor plate or something along that line. It is common, so we're lucky here, I guess, because common items only have a 15% chance to be magical. It's magical. It has the prefix vigorous, which adds health. So if we look up vigorous, this is going to add 483 health to the player. And we have the suffix of the defender, which is going to add 40 fortitude, which is, I imagine, to be a stat. So that's how I've done that here. Of the defender adds fortitude, which would be like a stat when you level up. You have stat points, you put that in there. All right, so with that, we can now spawn magical items, random prefixes, random suffixes, limited by weapon types. Magical is now correlated to the rarity of the item. We are randomly within a range that takes into account the map level. We are now determining the value of those stats of the magical properties. And yeah, I think with this you have a lot of ingredients, and of course, you know, you can mix it all up, right? You can when you determine the stat of the actual item, not the magical stats but the basic stat, you can also include that map modifier. You know, you can mix this up. I gave you a lot of ingredients here. I don't think, by no means, that I think this is like a complete system that is ready to go for a game. This is a system that has a little bit of every ingredient that you might choose to implement in your item generation system. So take it as a bunch of ingredients, mix and match them together. That fits your game the best that it could. And yeah, I hope you can make something cool with this. That was it for today, guys. Hope you liked this video. If you did, smash that like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget that little bell icon to make sure that you don't miss out on the next video. Talking about the next video, I again invite you to leave your comments down below what you want to have more in this item generation system, or as an ingredient for me to demonstrate to you how you could do that in Godot. Let me know in the comments, and if there is enough content there for another tutorial, another episode, I'll definitely make it. I hope to hear from you, and otherwise I'll see you in the next tutorial. Keep on gaming, keep on coding. See you later, guys.